The drums, when we get into the rhythm section, is going to be mostly fulfilling a rhythmic function. They're going to be kind of embellishing that time for us. They're going to be playing on the cymbal, on what's called the ride cymbal. It's a big cymbal, and they play with the stick, and usually that's kind of their way of relating to the rhythm section, telling them, this is where I think the pulse is. Ting, ting, tick, ting, tick, ting, ting, ting. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is improvisation is not just the soloist. Louis Armstrong is the culprit here, because Louis Armstrong really moved. Louis Armstrong's an interesting figure because he was the most important New Orleans jazz musician. He was also the single musician that kind of signaled an end to the New Orleans style of playing. The older school musicians in New Orleans at the time of Louis Armstrong's kind of arisal, they really thought he was a heretic and kind of a traitor, because he was really making this a solo music. And the original intent behind New Orleans music is it was a team effort. There's no I in team, right? It's like everybody contributes equally, nobody's supposed to have the spotlight on him. Louis really stepped out in front and said, I'm going to sing, I'm going to play the trumpet, I'm going to be the central figure. And that's still the way we tend to look at almost all musical performances, even in groups. You know, even the Rolling Stones, you know, you're not really paying that much attention, except the fact that he looks like he's going to die, maybe Keith Richards or something like that, or Charlie Watts. You know, a great drummer. Charlie Watts, great jazz drummer too. But, you know, you're really paying attention to Mick Jagger, right? I mean, it's always about Mick Jagger. And almost any group is like that, where there's a central figure and then kind of the other people are seen as being supplementary or accompaniment. Louis Armstrong's really the guy that signaled that sea change in jazz, is that it's going to be about the soloist now. And everybody else is going to sort of accompany. But everybody improvises. Everybody within their roles, and anybody that plays in those jam sessions will tell you, what they're doing on the drums is not the same from moment to moment. They have kind of a certain role. It's a lot like thinking in terms of like a baseball team. If the first base player says, I'm only covering this area, that's it, and the ball went over here, but I'm not going to bother with it. You know, you have to kind of change. You know, you have to adapt, and as the play changes and as the hitter changes, everybody shifts. And they are aware of these things, and my role is going to change as a first baseman. I'm going to come in a little bit more or go back. Probably even more apt is basketball, because guards, centers, forwards, if they just said, my responsibility as a guard is to just do this, that game moves much too fast. As it's moving, you know, the play is going to change, and your responsibility is going to change. So all of these people have responsibilities. The drummer to kind of keep the time, but to embellish the time and to communicate to the other players their personal kind of interpretation of the time and how they feel about this song. And so they're using the hi-hat, which we'll see in a minute, which is going to close on 2 and 4. Usually, when we're talking about swing feel, kind of a 4/4 swing, it's usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. You're going to hear a click on 2 and 4. He will also play a ride cymbal, which is his way of communicating with the bass player and going ting, 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 ting. Here's where I think the quarter note is, and you're a little slow, so I'm going to push you a little bit. Usually what makes jazz work is if you have a drummer that's going to push the bass player and the bass player is going to lay back, or vice versa. It never has to be one way or the other. But if both go in the same direction, you're kind of screwed. Like if the drummer starts pushing the beat and the bass player pushes the beat, it all falls apart. If the drummer lays back and the bass player lays back, it all falls apart. There has to be a tension between the two. So if the bass player is a little on the back side of the beat, then the drummer has to push him and kick him in the butt a little bit. And so there's always this kind of ebb and flow going on with the time, all the time between the ride cymbal, which is kind of his way of telegraphing that time, the ting, ting, ting. We should see that in this example. I didn't bring the actual DVD I usually use, so I'm using one off of YouTube. I'm hoping it's the same or close enough that I can show you some of these things. The bass player can play one note at a time usually, and so they can kind of outline the harmony by playing the roots of the chords. But they'll usually give you what you guys were just doing with clapping. Ba-doom, doom, 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 doom. They'll play on bum, 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 every one of those beats. Or they'll play a 2-beat. So if you were clapping again, sometimes you'll hear the bass player going boom, 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 ba-doom, boom, boom, ba-doom, ba-doom, boom. It's kind of broken. It's like he's playing 2 beats to every 4 that you clap. That's what we call a 2-beat feel. And a lot of times at the beginning of the tune, in our jam sessions at Pandora's, we'll say, play a 2-beat feel, or walk at the beginning, or play 2-beat. You know, those will be the instructions we usually give. And I think of this recording, hopefully, if it's similar to the one that I use on my DVD, they'll start out with a 2-beat, and it'll be like it feels like it's a gait. It kind of feels like it's skipping, But the time's still there. They're just not implicitly telling you bam, 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 bam. They're going ba-doom, 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 boom. It kind of sounds like a stutter or something. And that's usually sometimes they call it broken time. But it generally tends to be 2 beats to every 4 is kind of what's happening. Again, this is more technical than I usually get. The piano player then can play chords, and they can feed chords to, and they can play like a drummer too. They can kind of push the beat, or they can lay back, because they're improvising. What you see when you see a jazz group and you see a piano playing, they're playing chords in a certain key most of the times, but where and when they play those chords is totally left up to them. And if I picked 3 or 4 or 5 different piano players and had them rotate on the bench, and we were playing the same blues, you would hear 3, 4, or 5 completely different interpretations of the same chord progression, the same blues. But it has to do with how they were brought up, who they listened to, who they're influenced by. That's the beauty of this music, is that your own individual personality can come through. It takes a long time. I feel like, I mean, I've been doing this for more years than I care to admit to. And I'm going to be 50 next month. And I feel like I'm just starting to get to where I've got kind of a voice. I kind of that's the way I play. But it took me a long time, 35 years or so, and I'm just starting to feel like I'm getting there to where I kind of know what my voice is because of all of my influences and all this stuff. I mean, it's a never-ending process. And it goes on in a microcosm within a group. The group is kind of listening and pushing and pulling, and it's really, there's actually a book called Jazzocracy that's written by a guy that used to work, he was an intern that worked in Washington, D.C., and he's a bass player, and he's played for Wynton Marsalis's group. And he actually does this whole book based on how democracy and jazz is supposed to work kind of very similar, that you all have your individual voice, but it's supposed to be heard within the group, and it's supposed to be the group effort that kind of, so it's an American expression in that way, that we kind of came up with this idea of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, this kind of everybody's voice individually but together, and that this music actually is supposed to be doing that same thing. It doesn't always work that way, but you know, that's the ideal you're shooting for. This particular word that we use, comps, is really short for accompanies. You can see where it comes from, right there. But for some reason we've assigned this, we usually when we say comping, we are talking about piano players, which is a little inaccurate because guitar players comp, banjo players would comp, an accordion player would comp. Technically I do it. If you come in here, the trio that plays at Java starting tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we just play with a bass and a drum and myself. So a lot of times I'm comping. I play accompaniment. I don't play solo roles. I play little parts of the chord and stuff that's meant to support what the bass player or the drummer is doing. It might be a drum solo, but I'm playing something behind them. So even as a saxophonist, as a single note instrument, I can comp. So it's not just the sole territory of the pianist, but we tend to kind of think of it as a pianistic thing, because that's kind of one of their main functions. They're going to be the keepers of the chords, and they can kind of feed the chords to us in some sort of rhythmic way.